Tell them your story, Loki.
Me? Nobody wants to hear about that.
All a Loki wants is a place of their own to rule over as a supreme leader with glorious purpose. Is that too much to ask? Well, mostly, yeah. Naturally, spoilers ahoy. If you haven't caught up to the 5th episode of Loki, get to viewing. Loki has been wandering through Looking Glass after Looking Glass and stepping out of the regular flow of time and into the hands of the Time Variance Authority. At the end of the long and winding road seems to be a green castle. It's not likely to belong to the great and powerful Oz, so who does it belong to? Who has a fancy house at the end of all time? Let's get to it. How do you describe where a place is if that where involves a complicated notion of when and how that can be a place?
Clever wordplay.
To make matters even murkier, a place without a when can be a place that exists where time is simultaneous, but unless you're a temporal being, it just looks like a bunch of stuff happening all at once. That's how you end up with two places that exist out of time but having different rules. This has been Loki's journey after running into the Time Variance Authority for the crime of taking the Tesseract when the opportunity afforded itself. No one could remember that the Hulk hated stairs? The Time Variance Authority has set up their bureaucratic nightmare in the Null Time Zone, where they monitor all of time and the realities that make up the sacred timeline. With the help of their temp pads and time doors, all of time and space is at their disposal. Inside it, the variants that make up the time agents experience it as a linear march toward a time when the timekeepers arrange the end of one perfect timeline and the universe is in perfect harmony. Naturally, that bureaucracy was both ruthlessly efficient and overly complicated. If you're pruned from the timeline with one of the TVA agents' pruning sticks, it turns out they just get sent to a place where time is even more confusing, temporal limbo. We're all familiar with the concept of limbo, that place between places that isn't a place at all. Just like you can't really destroy anything so much as you can just make it into something else, it turns out you can't just erase timelines. You have to move them somewhere else. Some place where time is no longer part of the equation. That place at the end of time, temporal limbo. The TVA's landfill, where they've been filling it with all the lands and times and peoples they erased. Naturally, that place is teeming with Lokis, because Lokis survive, and scheme, and run from Alioth, the giant smoke monster that feeds off temporal energy. And it turns out that once you get past the giant smoke monster that feeds off of temporal energy, the princess wasn't in that castle, but there was one behind the smoke monster. Take that, people on Lost, you just needed Loki powers. Who builds a castle in a timeless void behind a raging smoke monster? A lot of people, but most of them all at one point or another go by the same name, Kang the Conqueror. Ask a history buff and they'll tell you that the person who built a castle isn't always the person who holds the castle, but they do get dibs on those first name rights and where the spires go. The story of how Nathaniel Richards built a castle in temporal limbo is complicated in the way only a person who constantly travels through time and different realities could be. While the Marvel Universe of the comics has several groups watching over time and space, they do a terrible job of it. There are a bunch of realities and they often get into destiny wars or secret wars or incursions. Then, to make matters worse, around 4949, their Nathaniel Richards got bored or frustrated or whatever, and they stumble upon a time machine and go skipping through time and space, doing so much conquering, they make it their name. One of those realities on Earth never had a Dark Ages, and as a result of constant uninterrupted development, eventually resulted in a time of peace and serenity, which bored Richards so he went to ancient Egypt and became Rama Tut until the Fantastic Four said no. Building with pieces of his broken dreams, Rama used his pharaoh status to have a castle constructed in this place he found, temporal limbo. It's a place where he won't get any older and he'd never die, all without cocoons or Steve Guttenberg. He was able to find help in Tempest, who he thought he found, but instead was created by him and sent back in time to help him out because time travel is complicated. There, he ruled over his realm and a bunch of variations of him that made up the Council of Kangs as Immortus, because branding is everything. Once you move into your new place, the next big hurdle you have to face is your neighbors. One of them was Alioth, who ruled over a time territory twice as large as Kang's and had a habit of absorbing time travelers and growing. This kept Kang between his own borders. The other neighbor they had to deal with is the TVA. They would give him control over the 7 millennia in which Kang messed with time as both punishment and reward, since most of his duties was involved with fixing the frayed timelines that exist because of his conquering ways. Of course, things happen, and if there's anyone who is able to die but not really and come back in convoluted ways more than a Loki, it's a Kang. Kang's contingency plan was to have his wife, or lover depending on who or when we're talking, take over. That person, of course, is Ravonna. That judge who may or may not know what's going on has a lot in common with her comic book counterpart, who also may or may not know what's going on. Because there were two Ravonnas. One was the Terminatrix, because why not, and the other was Revelation. Revelation was more upstream of Ravonna and the only one that knew they were one and the same. That is until one enlisted a group of Avengers who were sort of alternates themselves. US Agent, War Machine, and Thunderclap, a mortal with Thor's powers, ended up tasked with getting Ravonna to come to Revelation. Ravonna, thinking she was about to get assassinated, went and got the originals, Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor. Revelation thought this was her massively complicated plan to unite the two Ravonna territories and rid her of Alioth. But instead, it was the massively complicated plan by the Immortus Kang to feed the Council of Kangs to Alioth and then throw Tempest into the maw so that Alioth would be locked in place, so to speak, and act as a barrier to protect Castle Limbo. He also set up the time barrier that prevented his younger self from returning to his time that sent him back to Egypt and prompted him to build Castle Limbo. Again, time travel is weird. Castle Limbo allowed Kang as Immortus to spend his no time to study and acquire power, you know, regular villain stuff, while cleaning up timelines, like tricking Thor into visiting just so he could shave off the temporal power that Mjolnir managed to pick up. Where did Kang get the idea for a castle? I mean, most of us would have gotten the idea from a history book or a tour or Europe or fairy tales. All of those things are too pedestrian for someone who travels through time and conquers stuff. Family trees can get pretty complicated. That's how everyone thinks they're descended from royalty. The game of who is your daddy's 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 daddy can get complicated. One theory about who the important person in Kang's family tree is Reed Richards, Mr. Fantastic himself from the Fantastic Four. The other is Victor Von Doom, Reed Richards' most bitter enemy. Doom keeps it old school. He likes power, all kinds, and he rules over the monarchy of Latveria from his own castle, Castle Doom. Kang had gotten a glimpse of Castle Doom and how Doom rolled in general as one of the biggest threats in the Marvel Universe, and thought he needed to get in on that action. The question for the 6th episode is if that is in fact Castle Limbo or Castle Doom, and more importantly, who's the boss of that castle? The option that most people are leaning toward is Kang the Conqueror. Jonathan Majors from Lovecraft Country has been cast to play the time-conquering baddie in the upcoming Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. But with so much Kang-related stuff popping up in the Loki series, it seems all but certain Kang will show up. You know, just like how Mephisto showed up in WandaVision. The long shot banks on the rumor that Marvel has cast its Doctor Doom a long time ago, perhaps even sliding Michael Fassbender in the role, which they will reveal when the Lokis invade Castle Doom. Finally, of course, is that it's Lokis all the way down. While all the Loki variants, save the ones fighting over ruling temporal limbo, have been on redemption arcs, having to confront themselves at their worst to become their best would be a fitting end, even if that means Kang can wait. Sometimes the easiest answer is the answer, like Alligator Loki being an alligator and not a caiman like I insisted, based solely on caiman being small and Alligator Loki being small. But how could I look at that little round snout and not see, oh gosh, she's coming right for me, I'm sorry Alligator Loki.